Many thanks, Nick. That's very interesting. And now we're going to pass directly over to Francis, who is going to give a response from the perspective of Defra on how this research findings are relevant to your work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, Nick, for the excellent presentation. I just wanted to say thank you, because the climate risk and resilience survey is obviously an important feature of the programme, and Defra works very closely with the climate resilience champions, as Kate mentioned earlier, we have a huge interest and stake in it, and ensuring that research is useful and usable for our work as well. And this report definitely does that. So I've just been asked to say a few words as one of the target audiences for the research, but no doubt that the findings are very wide-ranging and applicable to a wide range of organisations. So just as an introduction, my name is Frances Pimenta, and I work at Defra, where I head up the adaptation policy team at Defra, but obviously work very closely alongside my climate evidence colleagues who have been instrumental as well as part of the stakeholder advisory panel for this piece of research. So just for context, Defra is the lead department on adaptation. So we are responsible for delivering adaptation duties set out in the Climate Change Act and communicating and coordinating across government. And the next few years will be very important ones in our 5-year statutory cycle. So as Nick mentioned, we will be having our next climate change risk assessment coming up, with the evidence report coming out next year. That's the third climate change risk assessment, and government's response to that in 2022. And then that will feed into the next national adaptation programme in 2023. So this is a really important time, and it's really helpful for us to have these findings now to inform that work. So I think, as I mentioned, policy audiences are just, I think, one of the important target users of this research, but I think it can go far and wide, be it to our press office colleagues who are really at the interface of communicating with wider external audiences, but also with some of our delivery bodies, and I think local government as well will be a really important user audience for this research. And so myself and my colleague, Livy Wright, also had the pleasure of attending some of the stakeholder advisory panel meetings last year, alongside colleagues from the devolved administrations, the Met Office and others. And I think we really appreciated the very collaborative approach taken into the research design process, and ensuring that, for example, the risks covered really matched up with our climate change risk assessment key risks to help us track the kind of perceptions to some of those risks that we know are really happening and salient. In terms of some of the standout findings for me, I was really drawn to the sections of the report on risk perceptions of climate impacts. As I mentioned, they tied up really closely with our priority risks in the UK under the climate change risk assessment. And I was also really spent some time thinking about the findings on climate priorities and public support around different adaptation policies. I think this is in general really important for us to take on board in terms of message framing and positioning, and thinking about both us and other parts of Defra and government in how we communicate and design our lines. And I can imagine that the healthcare sector will also be really interested in the findings. Obviously, a big kind of jump out message was around the salience of climate change, and the magnitude of that really kind of took a hold. So I think that kind of jump that we saw from users noting that kind of 23%, climate change being the 23% of respondents selected climate change as the most pressing issue over the next 20 years. And I think this is really meaningful because this was obviously a kind of open text response in place right at the beginning of the survey. So it feels like an organic response, and it certainly corresponds with the strong interest and engagement that we see coming in from members of the public. I think it was interesting to see the responses around emotions and climate change, and the levels of feelings like anxiety and concern and outrage popping up. I guess that's the sentiment that was definitely, I think, quite prominent around October last year, and it'll be interesting to see if that's still kind of factored and profiled in the same way. And I think it was also interesting to see how human health and the protection of the vulnerable, of vulnerable people, scored really highly around priorities. So perhaps there's a kind of narrative forming around that really kind of human impact of climate change over the next 20 years. But obviously it'll be really interesting to see how COVID has potentially affected some of those scores. I was interested to see the notable increase in perceptions related to heat waves, dry periods, and hot summers, which was took a big jump from the previous surveys and potentially came after that really hot summer in 2018. And I think it's really important that this in particular is recognised, because it is one of the UK's top 6 priority risks in the last climate change risk assessment. And it is an area where people do need to kind of think about their surroundings and take action. So it is really important that people are aware and taking it seriously. And as Nick said, I think there is an opportunity there to think about messaging and what people kind of perceive as a kind of route to action on that. It was also interesting to see the recognition of impacts on infrastructure in cities. I think that had a 20% jump, or 15 to 20% jump from the previous surveys. So that also perhaps was partly correlated to the heat risk factor. So I think that there's a few interesting points around that for us to take away and explore. And one other aspect that Nick picked up now was around the framing messages and that important point around adaptation and mitigation messages being able to kind of be positioned alongside each other in a mutually reinforcing way. And I know that it's sometimes been the case that people in the adaptation community have had questions around, or even pushback in the past, around the potential hazards around communicating on adaptation. It's really reassuring to see that we can have that kind of more holistic message, and it works and people understand it. So I thought that was important. So I think perhaps in terms of future questions where things are on my mind, I think, Nick, you mentioned the local factor, and one of the findings being that people may be uncertain around how climate impacts now are affecting or may affect their local communities. So there may be some more to do around that, and we've obviously got the kind of the local projections from the UK CP climate projections work of the Met Office, and so perhaps there's something around using those tools, those new tools, to get people thinking. And it also might be something that's really helpful for local authorities to bear in mind when it's part of their kind of policy design and outreach work. It would be interesting to kind of break down perhaps some of this analysis if possible, or in future, around the extent to which different locations have impacted people's experiences and responses. So that's kind of food for thought there. But in general, this is, I think, a really kind of important time to be having these results, and looking forward to the next set of results that Nick mentioned. Different government departments are ramping up their work on engagement and research and understanding preferences and behaviours, including to different policy pathways. So I think especially on the mitigation side. But what's really important is that this evidence here gives us the analysis on adaptation options, which I hope can then be analysed side to side as part of that more holistic picture. Other kind of big opportunities, we've had recently the new Climate Risk website published, so it launched. So that's the Committee on Climate Change have launched that, and it provides a really helpful platform to disseminate and publicise the kind of evidence products and evidence report for the next climate change risk assessment. And I think there's a whole kind of a whole opportunity here around greater kind of awareness and access to some of that new evidence. And obviously we've had the briefing from Climate Outreach for UK communicators around the key messages from this report. So I think there's a lot going on there. With COP26 coming up next year, hosted in Glasgow, there's another opportunity. So adaptation resilience are one of the key campaign themes. So we can certainly be sharing these findings with campaign officials working on that to help them position and frame their kind of policy and engagement work. And I think as a kind of overall impression, just as a takeaway from this finding, I think I'm incredibly heartened by that message around the strong, overwhelming support for the range of adaptation measures and options, which was supported by, if I'm not mistaken, 75% of respondents. So that, I think, is just an incredibly helpful grounding for our policy work domestically, and it gives us that evidence base to support some of the policy development work we might want to be doing in future to show that level of public support. So I think just to wrap up, I think this report on climate risk and resilience is a hugely important reference that builds on the legacy of the 2013 and 2016 studies and allows us to track responses and perceptions over time. And it will support us and our communications and evidence colleagues to further kind of shape our work around the priorities that were referenced and make that case for additional action. And I think just on a personal note, it's been fascinating to explore the research design process and the wide range of questions developed for this survey. So I'm really looking forward to seeing applications in future, both of the research findings itself and also the communications briefing for communicators.